I will talk about the same topic, of course, but in another way or from another perspective. I will talk about his view on transnational democracy by going back to his earlier work and see if I can say something, explain his view on transnational things by going back to these earlier works. So Habermas, as we also heard before here, worked out both his social theory and his political theory before globalization became an important and obvious conditions for the possibility of realizing justice and democracy. So his point of departure for incorporating these new conditions became then, and not surprisingly, theories he previously had worked out. His previous work on the national preconditions of private and public autonomy were presupposed rather than thematized in his earlier work. I mean, they became only clear, one can say, from the perspective of globalization. So social scientists in general and predominantly had until the 90s tacitly taken for granted what the German sociologist Ulrich Beck has called a container theory of society. And that means the idea that the society and the nation have the same territorial borders. I think that's the container theory. That society and nation has the same territorial borders. That was a kind of presupposition in many ways and for many people. And this oversight, I think, can be excused because there has been many waves of globalization, more or less radical, in world history. But the most recent one and the most radical one is part of the turn from what you can call from a welfare state society to a neoliberal enterprise society and a competition state. And that only began, you can say, from the end of the 70s. So, but I think that still today, many social scientists, politicians and participants in public debates rather desperately tend to hold on to the illusion of a match between nation and society. I think also that to read Habermas writing on this subject since, let's say, the middle of the 90s, is to my mind one of the best ways to overcome this illusion. So my intention with my contribution tonight is then to open up a discussion about the advantages and disadvantages of Habermas' ideas on this topic. But I will do that in a special way, as I indicated in the beginning, namely by using his earlier, let's say, pre-post-national theories about rights and democracy as a kind of yardstick for evaluating his post-national theories. One could say that his earlier theories that we also heard here before is more basic in the sense that they are meant to show in a more abstract way the theoretical contributions for democracy and rights. I am in that way, I'm relating my talk today to an ongoing discussion which use an earlier Habermas to criticize a later Habermas. I mean, there are also controversies about this more recent turn that he has made, as we also heard before. So, to be able to do that, I need to take 5 steps. The first step that I need to take is to say something about Habermas' pre-post-national theories of societies and politics in order to clarify his basic theoretical point of departure. The second step is that I need to say something about how he understands the new conditions and problems of our post-national era. And thirdly, in order to evaluate Habermas' suggestions to solve this problem, I need to say something about what social criticism means for Habermas. I mean, this is the idea of social criticism that we find in the so-called Frankfurt School of Critical Theory. Then fourth, of course I should say something about the solution that he suggests, and finally to judge Habermas' suggestion from the standpoint of his more basic theories. But to go through all these steps in a satisfying way in 20 minutes or 15 minutes is of course impossible. So I will leave the fifth step to the discussion, and I'm also lucky to have the talk before me, so I don't need to say so much about the fourth step. The fourth step that is his solutions. We already heard something. I will say a few things about it, but we already heard something about it already. So I will limit myself to the first three steps and see how far I come. But also this is things that you could talk for hours, so I can only give some indication. So let me start with the first step, Habermas' basic social and political theoretical assumption. I don't know how acquainted you are with Habermas' theory, but I will go through this as fast as I can. So, in many ways, classical sociology is the model for his social theory. His intention, I mean in the theory of communicative action, was to work out what sometimes is called a grand social theory of modernity. The problem is here, the basic problem is here, how is a modern society possible? And that question is put in the view of modern social processes of individualization, pluralization, the decline of the power of traditions, and the crucial ideals and struggles for individual freedom. So how is society possible? How is an integration possible in view of these processes? So this is a question of integration, and I mean it's much discussed today, as you know, but this is a question that is as old as modern society. So in my context of my 5-step and our topics today, I think that I have decided to use the concept of legitimation to explicate Habermas' answer to this basic question, how is society possible? And I will quickly turn back to 1651 and to one of the first modern accounts of the problem of social order and integration. It was written in view of the religious war that at the time had devastated large parts of Europe. And I'm thinking about Thomas Hobbes' Leviathan. And I will only pick one formulation from this book, which I find crucial. This is a quote: "The weakest has the strength enough to kill the strong." The weakest has the strength enough to kill the strong. End of quote. This is not a moral claim, but rather something we can learn from history. So the claim says that pure strength and force cannot uphold social order. But Hobbes' own suggestion to a solution is neither that of classical sociology or that of Habermas. We must rather turn to Rousseau and his development of Hobbes' claim. And here's a quote from Rousseau. He says that it's clear that he takes the point that he goes on from what Hobbes, the earlier quote from Hobbes. He says, "The strongest is never strong enough to be always the master, unless he transforms strength into right and obedience into duty. End of quote. So Rousseau, in contrast to Hobbes, understands society, as this is also a quote, as a moral and collective body. So this is where the concept of legitimation comes into the picture. Habermas has stated, and this is also a quote that I think is important, legitimacy means a political order, a political order's worthiness to be recognized. Legitimacy means a political order's worthiness to be recognized. I think we should keep that formulation in mind. So, against the so-called realists, Habermas argues that social order presupposes not just power, but also needs legitimation based on some kind of normative validity. And again, this is not only a moral claim, but also a sociological claim. The realists are, so to say, not realistic enough. They have not seen the reality of the normative condition of a society. That is, the social and political significance of ideals, convictions, values, justifications, and so on. So, but that does not mean that we should understand the reality of the normative in a Nietzschean way either. That is, to understand morality as an instrument of domination. So just as little as we can do without normativity, we can reduce normativity to power. Validity, or if you like reason, is intrinsic to the normativity that the legitimation of political and social order requires, according to Habermas. So the next question then is how to understand normative validity. The foundation of normative validity, according to Habermas, cannot be in the form of substantial values. Normative questions are not for priests, philosophers, or politicians to decide in some kind of paternalistic way. We need a post-metaphysical notion of validity. This is one of the reasons why Habermas works out a procedural and indirect conception of validity. It is only the fair conditions for how to come to an agreement in normative matters that in the last instance can legitimate political power and social order. So this way of reasoning leads Habermas then to a communicative and a deliberative model of democracy. To the extent that political deliberations among citizens follow procedures and include everybody concerned and exclude violence and manipulation, these deliberations are to be understood as mechanism of legitimation. That is, not convictions or substantial values, but our institutionalized right to try to convince others by means of the better argument. So, from a Habermasian perspective, one might be skeptical about the expression European values that we find in the announcement for our discussion here tonight, but that we might turn back to. So that means that only deliberative procedures of democracy can legitimate political power and make a modern society possible. His notion of deliberative democracy can be seen as a combination of a liberal and a republican model of democracy. It is a model where individual rights are just as important as political debates in the public sphere of the civil society and the parliament. So these two sides of democracy are to be seen as interdependent. Public autonomy presupposes rights of different kind, and these rights are the result of public autonomy. So Citizens are both, as we heard before, the authors and the addressees of law. Human rights are the preconditions for public autonomy, but such rights are always in need of deliberations in matter of interpretation, application, and so on. So this was a bit too long on the first step, but keep in mind Habermas' basic position in matters of political and social order differs from the realist, the Nietzschean, the liberal, and the republic position. So the second step: what are the basic problems of our new post-national era, seen from the perspective of Habermas? When he describes our present political situation, Habermas often take the point of departure in a basic distinction, which has been crucial in international relations since the peace of the Westphalian Treaty in 1648. To be sure, since the end of the First World War, attempts have been made to overcome this distinction, but after the fall of the welfare state, there cannot anymore be any doubt about that these attempts has been insufficient. I'm talking about the distinction between, in Habermas' terms, the inner sovereignty of the people and the outer sovereignty of nation states. As a consequence of these distinctions, citizens has only, in the best cases, rights and security within the nation state. Outside national borders, only nation states have rights, and then only the right to self-determination and self-assertion. Individuals are only subjects of rights as citizens in a particular nation state. The international space is not a shared space and not a moral space. It is a strategical space of diplomacy and pure power. In this situation, the concept of legitimation has no meaning outside the nation state. There is no supranational power in need of legitimation that might interfere in the doings of nation states on moral and legal grounds. So this international order has always been highly problematic, of course. Actually, we can only talk about order in a minimal sense of the world. According to this basic distinction, there is no protection and no rights for non-citizens. There is no security and rights for citizens of nation states that do not follow the rule of law or some principles of democracy. There is no protection from violence and war on an international level. This order did not prevent world wars and genocide during the 20th century, and not centuries of colonialism and imperialism. On the international level, we simply don't have social and political order, and the price is violence and death. The rather recent Cold War arrangement and the so-called Pax Americana were not in need of legitimation and did not follow any rule of law. Any supranational protection of individuals during that epoch has been totally arbitrary. So, as you know, before the recent and radical wave of globalization, attempts to establish some kind of international law based on human rights and institutionalized through some kind of association of nation states to deal with this problem has been, to some extent, realized. These attempts could be seen as promising, in spite of all well-known hindrances, until I would say, or Habermas would say, until this new wave of globalization. Because this new wave of globalization from the end of the 70s meant that also a decreasing inner sovereignty of citizens occurred. Before this wave, nation and society still had a common territory to some degree. It could be seen as enough for individual political autonomy, at least to some degree. It could make that credible to some degree. Citizen could, before that, understand themselves as authors of law that they themselves should obey. That is, political power could still be legitimized and a modern order could still be seen as possible on this national level. Today that is not longer possible. We don't live anymore in a national society with a national state, or we do it only to a part. We rather live in a world society without a world state. And I have no time now to remind you of all the aspects of globalization, but I mean, just think about trade, climate, migration, and so on. Anyway, it's no longer possible to legitimize powers that affect our daily lives the way we once, at least to some degree, could. So the inner sovereignty of the people, which was for a while halfway realized, at least in some places, is gone. We live rather in a post-democratic, under post-democratic conditions. So consequently, the classical sociological question needs a new answer. How is society possible? How is social order possible in a globalized world? So that was step 2. If I still have time, I will go to step 3. And that was about how Habermas understands social criticism. As you know, his intellectual background in critical theory of the he has his background in the critical theory of the Frankfurt School. And I would say that in spite all the differences between its members, there are common traits, how we should understand doing critical theory. Of course, none of them believe in the scientific ideal of value neutrality, social theory that try to live up to such a condition and such an ideal must suppress and conceal normative and ontological presupposition. We should instead, according to this school, be reflexive about unavoidable normative and ontological preposition. Social and political theory should have some competence in normative reasoning. For our subject today, I think that's quite obvious. However, as much as Habermas rejects what he called an empiricist as social theory, he also rejects what has been called what he calls a normativist conception of theorizing. A common misunderstanding of people who haven't read so much of his work, I would say, is that Habermas is an idealist or even a utopian thinker. I think this is simply wrong. What unites Habermas with Adorno, Horkheimer, and even Marx and Hegel in the generation before him, and, for instance, Axel Honneth, Rahel Jägi, Hartmut Rosa in the generation after him, is the idea of immanent critique. Habermas calls this sometimes reconstruction. Critical theory does not simply mean that social scientists and philosophers should cooperate. It also means that social critique should not come from above, as some kind of paternalist philosopher king would do it. Social critique rather finds its normative point of departure in the society that is criticized. It is the conditions of the possibility of the realization of a normativity immanent in society that a critical theory should reconstruct and take as its point of departure. So I think this middle position between an empiricist and a normativist says something about how Habermas deals with the question of our post-national situation. So, now the fourth step, if we have time. And I will do that very quickly because we have heard about it already. So if we take our point of departure in step 1 and 2, it could lead to the expectation that Habermas would in some way transfer the national state model of democracy to a post-national situation. That is, develop some idea of a world republic. However, he rejects that for several reasons, and one of the reasons I think we find in step 3, his understanding of social criticism. He is not a normativist thinker. The empirical world has to meet halfway, entgegenkommen, as he puts it in German. So what he suggests, as we heard, is a politically ordered world society, a world citizen society without a world government. And then we have this multi-level political system that we just heard about with 3 different independent levels. So, and now I come to the end. These different levels, I mean the supranational, the transnational and the national level, have different tasks, as we saw. They have different kinds of collective actors. And it seems that Habermas claims that on these 3 different levels, different forms of legitimation processes are possible. So we could say that these differentiations of possible forms of legitimation are crucial for how to judge his suggestion, his solution that we heard of before. So the crucial question, I think, and he says that himself, is legitimation on these 3 levels possible? Habermas talks about to secure canals or chains of legitimation. And I think that's the crucial question, how to judge or evaluate his suggestions of solution. If it's not possible to see these processes of legitimations in some way on these 3 levels, then I think we can use the earlier Habermas to criticize the later Habermas. Okay, thank you.